Perhaps everyone has a dream. For some, it's a sleek sports car. For others, it might be a trip around the world. As for me, my dream has always had the scent of old wood, the sound of rain on tall window panes, and the cool air of an old European city. My dream was a house in Amsterdam. Not a flashy, modern apartment in Zuidas, but a real house. One of those characteristically narrow, tall canal houses, crowded together along the quiet canals of the Jordan district. I worked like crazy for years, saving every euro, just to make that dream a reality. And finally, I did it. It was a house that needed a lot of care. The paint was peeling, the floors creaked, and the plumbing probably hadn't been changed since Rembrandt's time. But it was mine. The first few weeks passed in a happy chaos. I spent my days scraping old paint, patching cracks, and getting to know every sound the house made. I knew exactly how the wooden staircase groaned on the 5th step, how the wind whistled through the gap in the bedroom window. I was turning an old piece of architecture into my home. It was a strange sense of peace, a normality that I had longed for so long. I thought I had finally found where I belonged, a safe harbor to drop anchor after so many years adrift. It all started on a damp Tuesday afternoon, when I decided to tackle the oak floor in the living room. It had warped in a corner near the wall adjoining the canal. I figured it was from centuries of accumulated moisture. When I used a crowbar to pry up a warped board, it came up more easily than I expected. Underneath wasn't the subfloor I was expecting, but a small, dark void. At first, I just thought it was part of the old house's structure, but there was something nestled neatly in the corner, wrapped in a discolored piece of oilcloth. My heart beat a little faster. People always joke about finding treasure in these old Amsterdam houses. Could it be? I reached into the cold space and pulled the object out. It was heavier than I thought. As I carefully unwrapped the decaying oilcloth, what was revealed wasn't gold or silver. It was a small notebook, bound in dark leather that had hardened and cracked with age. There was no lock, just a thin leather cord tied around it. Curiosity won over any hesitation. I sat right down on the dusty floor, carefully untied the leather cord, and opened the first page. The script inside was breathtakingly beautiful, slanted characters written in brown ink on parchment. Though I'm no expert, I could guess it was written in Old Dutch. And in the top corner of the first page, there was a name and a year. Peter van der Meer, 1636. Holding the diary, I felt like I was touching another world. 1636. It was the height of the Dutch Golden Age, and also the peak of one of history's most insane speculative bubbles, the tulip mania. I had read about it in school. People poured fortunes into rare tulip bulbs, hoping to sell them for a higher price. Many became millionaires overnight, and just as many lost everything when the bubble burst. I made a cup of coffee, sat in my old armchair, and began to read. Thanks to living here for a while, my Dutch was good enough to understand most of what Peter wrote, though I sometimes struggled with the archaic words. The first few pages were just as I expected. Peter was a merchant, and he wrote about his deals, his shipments, and his frustrations with his competitors. But above all, he was obsessed with tulips. He wrote not just of their prices, but of their beauty, the veins on their petals, their unique colors. He yearned to possess something unique, something that would make him immortal in the world of horticulture. A solid black tulip, a legend that many believed to be impossible. As I read deeper, Peter's tone began to change. Business calculations gave way to a growing obsession. He started writing about sleepless nights, spent wandering along the canal outside the house. He described the black water and the feeling that something was down there, an ancient intelligence that had watched Amsterdam rise from a small fishing village. He called it the Heer van de Gracht, the master of the canal. I chuckled, thinking it was just the flowery language of a stressed-out 17th century man. But then Peter wrote of a pact. He didn't go into detail, but he implied he had offered something to the canal, and in return, the master had promised to grant him his deepest desire. A few days later, a strange event occurred. A driverless barge crashed into and heavily damaged the warehouse of Peter's biggest rival. Peter wrote about it in his diary with a cold glee, taking it as the first sign that the pact had been accepted. At the same time, in the small garden behind the house, a tulip bulb he had long since discarded suddenly began to sprout. I put the diary down, feeling a slight chill. The story was fascinating, but also unsettling. I told myself it was just the ramblings of a man from a superstitious age. I got up to get more coffee, and as I walked past the corner where I found the diary, I stopped. There was a faint scent in the air, a smell of damp earth, like a cellar, but mixed with a sweet fragrance, almost like hyacinths, but with something wrong, like the smell of flowers just beginning to rot. I bent down, smelling closer to the floor. The scent seemed to be rising from the wooden boards themselves. It's just the damp, I told myself. This house is hundreds of years old. It's bound to have strange smells. But the thought didn't make me feel any better. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house, every gurgle of water in the old pipes, seemed to take on a new meaning. I felt as if I were no longer alone. I kept thinking of Peter and his master of the canal. It was ridiculous. This was the 21st century. But as I lay in bed, staring at the dark ceiling, I could have sworn I heard another sound besides the rain. A very faint whisper, not quite words, that seemed to be coming up from the plumbing, from the very water flowing beneath my house. Paranoia choked me. I tried to reassure myself that it was just my imagination, a combination of an old story and a deteriorating house. But I couldn't stop reading. The diary was like a magnet, and I had to know how Peter's story ended. I flipped to the final pages. Peter's handwriting had become a frantic, panicked scrawl. The black tulip had finally bloomed. He described it with a mixture of awe and disgust. It was unnaturally beautiful, its petals a deep, velvety black, with even darker veins running through them like capillaries. And its scent, he wrote, overwhelmed the house. A sweet yet cloying smell of damp earth and decay. It was the same scent I was smelling right at this moment. Then, on the very last page, the truth was revealed. The pact wasn't for wealth. The master of the canal didn't want gold or offerings. The price for the legendary black tulip was the master of the house himself. The pact was a curse, an eternal bond passed from one owner to the next. It does not take what you own, Peter wrote, the letters scratching at the page. It takes you. He had tried to break the curse by hiding the diary, hoping the next owner would never find it. The moment I read the final line, the whispering from the pipes suddenly grew clearer. It was no longer a meaningless sound. It was calling a name, Peter, and then it called my name. The cloying, rotten floral scent flooded my nostrils, making me gag. In horror, I looked down at my trembling hands. Under the room's dim yellow light, I could see faint, dark, vein-like patterns beginning to form beneath my skin, spreading from my fingertips, twisting like roots, identical to what Peter had described on the petals of his black tulip. Primal, ice-cold fear shot up my spine. I screamed and threw the diary to the floor. It landed with a dry thud. I had to get out. I scrambled to the front door, wrenching the handle. It wouldn't budge. The ancient oak door seemed to have swollen with the damp, jamming itself tight in the frame. I threw my shoulder against it with all my might, once, twice. Panic fueled my adrenaline. Finally, with a splintering crack of wood, the door burst open. I tumbled out onto the cobblestone street outside, the cold Amsterdam night air hitting my lungs. I didn't dare look back. I just ran over the arched bridges, ran along the shimmering canals, ran until the quiet alleys of the Jordan were far behind me and I found myself standing in the bright lights and noise of Dam Square. I never went back to that house. I left everything behind. My clothes, my computer, the furniture I had so carefully hunted for. The next day, from a coffee shop, I emailed a real estate agency, telling them to sell the house at any price. I didn't need the money. I just needed to be free of it. I live somewhere else now, in a modern city of concrete and glass. But the curse follows me. Sometimes, late at night, I still catch a whiff of that scent, sweet and rotten. Occasionally, I still jolt awake, convinced I can hear whispers from the plumbing. And every morning, the first thing I do is look at my hands, an obsessive, compulsive check. just to make sure the dark patterns haven't returned. I know the house is still there, by the canal, waiting. It is patient, and sooner or later someone else with the same dream I had will walk through that door. They will find a loose floorboard, and the cycle will begin again. When you date someone from a different culture, you get used to a lot of things. New foods, holidays you've never heard of, and clumsy attempts at pronouncing their family members' names. For me, a guy from London, and Anya, my Austrian girlfriend, that meant I learned to love schnitzel more than fish and chips, and that putting ice in wine is an unforgivable crime. So, when she invited me to her home in a small village near Salzburg for Christmas, I was thrilled. It was a big step in our relationship. "My family will love you," she said, her eyes sparkling. "But you have to be prepared. My parents are a bit traditional." I just laughed. I imagined a perfect holiday. Days of skiing, cozy evenings by the fire, and experiencing a real European Christmas for the first time. The flight to Salzburg was easy, and the drive up into the mountains was breathtaking. Snow-covered peaks rose majestically against a deep blue sky. Her family's home, a large wooden chalet, sat isolated on a hillside, looking exactly like a postcard. It was perfect, a beautiful normality, a winter dream come true. I thought this was going to be the best vacation of my life. Anya's parents, Klaus and Helena, were just as I expected. They were warm, charming people with hospitable smiles. Klaus, a tall man with a silver beard, gave me a firm handshake, while Helena hugged me as if I were her own son. The inside of the house was even more wonderful than the outside, with dark wooden beams, thick wool rugs, and the scent of gingerbread and pine filling the air. I felt completely at ease. Everything was perfect until the first evening, when I noticed the first strange rule. As the sun began to set, painting the snowy landscape in brilliant shades of pink and orange, I opened a window in the living room to take a picture. Instantly, Helena hurried over, a slightly strained smile on her face. "Oh, Leo, dear," she said, her voice gentle but with an undeniable urgency. "We don't open the north-facing windows after sunset." She gently closed and latched the window. I looked at Anya, raising an eyebrow in question. She just shrugged and smiled. "Just one of my parents' old traditions," she whispered, "to keep the warmth in." It seemed plausible, but there was something in Helena's haste, in the way she glanced out at the gathering darkness, that gave me a vague sense of unease. The first seed of doubt had been planted, almost unnoticeably small, in the perfect soil of my winter holiday. Over the next few days, more of these strange traditions appeared, like small cracks in a perfect oil painting. Above every doorway in the house, I noticed a bundle of dry birch twigs tied together with a red ribbon. When I asked Anya about them, she just giggled and said, "For good luck. My father believes in these things." Then at night, when the house was silent, I started hearing a strange sound from the forest outside. A rhythmic clanking, like chains being dragged over frozen ground. I mentioned it to Klaus at breakfast. He just nodded dismissively, not looking up from his newspaper. "Probably the wind in the old ski lift pylons," he said. "They make noise all season." The explanation seemed reasonable, but the sound I heard felt more deliberate, more rhythmic than the random clang of metal. I tried to go online to learn more about local Christmas traditions, especially about Krampus, the half-goat, half-demon creature I vaguely remembered as St. Nicholas's companion who punishes naughty children. But the Wi-Fi connection in the house was suspiciously weak. Pages loaded very slowly or not at all. Klaus said it was the mountain air interfering with the signal, but I couldn't help but feel that this isolation was intentional. The incident that truly worried me happened on the third day. After a walk in the snow, I left my muddy boots outside the back door to dry. A few minutes later, Klaus opened the door and saw them. His friendly face instantly hardened. "Leo," he said, his voice low and stern, all warmth gone. "Never leave anything of yours outside after dark, especially shoes." He used a fireplace poker to pick up the boots, holding them as if they were contaminated, and placed them inside. Helena, who had seen the whole thing, turned pale and hurriedly said something to Klaus in German too fast for me to understand. The atmosphere in the room suddenly became heavy, suffocating. Their charm had vanished, replaced by a raw, almost panicked fear. Anya quickly pulled me aside. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, avoiding my eyes. "My parents are very superstitious about Krampusnacht, the night of December 5th. They believe that if you leave things outside, Krampus can use them to track you to the house." She tried to smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's just old stories, to scare the children." But I knew what I had just seen wasn't a joke. It was real fear. From that moment on, I no longer felt like a guest. I felt like a liability, an outsider who could break the invisible rules that were protecting them. And today it was December 5th. As the evening shadows began to stretch across the snow, the family began their final preparations. Helena went around the house, sprinkling salt on the windowsills, while Klaus used a hammer to securely fasten all the shutters. No one said a word. The silence was more terrifying than any scream. When the last shutter was bolted, the house plunged into an almost absolute darkness, broken only by the flickering, dancing light of the fire in the hearth. Klaus, Anya's father, turned to look at us, his face a mask of tension. "Everyone," he said, his voice low and clear, echoing in the silence. "We will stay in this room. No one is to leave, no one is to make a loud noise, and most importantly, no matter what you hear, no one opens the door until sunrise." He didn't say it as a suggestion, but as a command. We sat in silence. Anya pressed close to me, her hand as cold as ice. Helena was murmuring prayers, her fingers clasped tightly together. Time seemed to crawl by with painful slowness. Every minute felt like an hour, and then we heard it. At first, just a faint clanking from a distance, the sound of chains I had heard on previous nights. But this time it was no longer in the forest. It was getting closer. Then came the footsteps, a heavy, uneven thudding on the thick snow, like a large animal circling the house. Scratching began at the shutters, the sound of claws scraping frantically at the wood. A deep, guttural sniff echoed from just outside the main door, the sound of a beast scenting the air. Anya squeezed my hand, her nails digging into my flesh. I looked into her eyes, and for the first time, I saw pure, unmasked terror. This wasn't superstition. This wasn't a game. At that moment, a horrific sound erupted, a powerful impact, as if a boulder had been thrown against the main door, shook the entire house. The door groaned and rattled violently in its frame. It was not a human knock. It was a bestial slam, full of rage and hunger. The nightmare lasted for hours. The slamming on the door and the frantic scratching repeated over and over, sometimes at the front door, sometimes at the sealed windows, as if whatever was out there was searching for a weak point in our defenses. We sat there, frozen in fear, a small family imprisoned in our own home, besieged by something from the oldest, darkest stories. No one dared to cry. No one dared to breathe too loudly. We just listened and waited. Then, as abruptly as it began, all sounds stopped. A silence fell over us, heavier and more terrifying than the noise before it. We still didn't dare to move. We waited, our eyes glued to the small cracks in the shutters, waiting for a sign. Finally, a single weak ray of dawn crept through a crack, casting a thin sliver of light on the dusty floor. Only then did Klaus, looking as though he had aged 10 years in a single night, slowly stand up and tremblingly remove the bar from the door. He pushed the heavy door open. I held my breath, looking outside. The pristine white snow from the night before was now disturbed by massive prints, not human, but of a cloven hoof, circling the house. And right on the threshold, at the very spot where I had left my boots the day before, lay a clump of long, coarse, black hair and a single dirty birch switch. It had come for me. My mistake had almost cost them everything. The holiday was over. The car ride back to the airport was silent. My relationship with Anya was shattered, crushed by the weight of the secret she had kept. I returned to London, but a part of me remains in that chalet. I never found out what her family had done to earn their prosperity, or what their pact with that thing entailed. I only know that once a year a price had to be paid, And this year, that price was supposed to be me. Anyone who has moved to a new city for university knows the feeling. It's a mix of terror and absolute excitement. You're free, but you're also completely alone. That was me, Jonas, 20 years old, standing amidst cardboard boxes in my first ever apartment in Berlin. After weeks of desperate searching, I had found this place. A suspiciously cheap flat in an old Altbau building in the Prenzlauer Berg district. These buildings are everywhere in former East Berlin, pre-war architectural works with soaring ceilings, large windows, and quiet inner courtyards. My apartment had all of that charm and all of the accompanying drawbacks. The paint was peeling, the radiator rattled like a dying beast, and the wooden floors groaned in protest with every step I took. But it was mine. The first week passed in a whirlwind of studying and unpacking. I learned the U-Bahn system, found the best coffee shop in the neighborhood, and got used to the building's noises. It was a boring yet pleasant normality. My life was simply about going to class, coming home, and trying to turn an empty space into a place called home. I was completely unprepared for the fact that I was about to find something that would shatter that fragile peace. It all started on a Saturday afternoon. While cleaning a ridiculously high kitchen cabinet that had probably not been opened since the fall of the Berlin Wall, my hand brushed against something in the far back corner. It was an old shoebox, covered in a thick layer of dust. With a bit of curiosity, I pulled it out and placed it on the table. Inside weren't shoes. Instead, there were about a dozen old cassette tapes, each affixed with a small white label bearing a date from the mid-1980s. No name, no title, just numbers. It was strange. A few months ago, out of nostalgia, I had bought an old Walkman at a flea market. Now, it seemed I had something to listen to. I put the tape with the earliest date into the machine, put on the headphones, and pressed play. After a soft hiss, a voice came through, a man's voice, speaking in German. His tone was low and a little weary. "Audio diary," he said. "October 12th, 1984. He began to describe his day, utterly mundane things. His job at a state-owned factory, the quality of the currywurst in the canteen, and his annoyance with the weather. It was almost sleep-inducing. I was about to turn it off until he said one final sentence before the tape ended. "Herr Schmidt from downstairs brought me some pickles again. Such a friendly man." There was something in the way he stressed the word such, an almost imperceptible hesitation, that planted a seed of curiosity in my mind. That curiosity kept me listening. At first, it was like a unique window into life in the GDR, a living history lesson. The man on the tape, whom I mentally named Ulrich, continued to record his daily life. But gradually, his tone changed. Boredom gave way to a simmering anxiety. In one tape, Ulrich complained about strange clicking sounds on his phone line whenever he called his family in West Germany. "It's like someone is picking up the receiver and putting it back down," he said. The very next day, while I was talking to my mother on the apartment's landline, I heard it too. A dry, sharp click. I chalked it up to the building's old wiring. Perfectly normal. A few tapes later, Ulrich began to suspect his mail was being read. He described envelopes that looked like they had been steamed open and clumsily resealed. That week, I received a postcard from a friend who was traveling. There was an odd crease in the corner, and the stamp looked like it had been glued back on. It must have been damaged in transit, I told myself. Ulrich's paranoia was contagious. But my self-assurance began to crack when I got to the tape labeled June 1985. Ulrich's voice had become an urgent whisper. He was convinced that Herr Schmidt, the such a friendly neighbor, was a Stasi informant assigned to watch him. He described hearing footsteps in the attic apartment above his, at odd hours of the night, even though it was supposed to be empty. That night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard it too. Slow, deliberate footsteps, right above my bedroom ceiling. The next morning, I asked the building manager. She gave me a strange look. "No one's up there, kid," she said. "That flat's under renovation, completely empty." Now, a real sense of unease began to creep in. Ulrich became increasingly frantic on the tapes. He talked about hearing codes in the radio broadcasts, repeating patterns of static that he believed were messages being sent. 3 short hisses, a pause, then 3 short hisses again. It was a very specific sequence. One evening, while listening to an online radio station from my laptop, the stream suddenly cut out. It was replaced by silence. Then hiss, hiss, hiss. A pause. Hiss, hiss, hiss. My blood ran cold. That could not be a coincidence. Ulrich's voice on the last few tapes was barely audible. He whispered about shadows in the corner of his eye, about the feeling of never being alone, even in his own apartment. And I too was beginning to feel it. A cold draft on the back of my neck even though the windows were closed. A flicker of movement in the hallway mirror when I wasn't looking. I didn't know anymore. Were these tapes planting paranoia in my head? Or was I truly inheriting the ghost of a surveillance operation that had never really ended? I couldn't take it anymore. The ambiguity between past and present, between paranoia and reality, was tearing my mind apart. I had to know. I had to know where those footsteps were coming from. One evening, armed with a flashlight and a heart hammering against my ribs, I snuck up the stairs to the attic apartment. The door was unlocked. My heart skipped a beat. The manager said it was under renovation. Maybe they forgot to lock it. I pushed the door gently. It opened with a mournful creak. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust and plaster. Everything was covered in white sheets, looking like waiting ghosts. The apartment was indeed empty, but as I swept my flashlight across the living room, the room directly above my own, I saw something unusual. In the middle of the floor, a section of the wooden floorboards had been removed, exposing the support beams and the dark void below. I slowly approached, my heart racing. I pointed the flashlight down, and I saw it. I saw my own living room from above. My armchair, my coffee table, my open laptop. But that wasn't what horrified me. It was what lay in the space between the 2 floors. It wasn't old, clunky Stasi listening equipment. Instead, it was a complex web of thin, modern fiber optic cables and several tiny, black microcameras, all pointed directly down into my apartment. One of them had a tiny, red LED light, blinking steadily. It was active. It was watching. Ulrich's paranoia wasn't paranoia. It had just never ended. It had only been upgraded. I don't remember how I ran out of that apartment. Panic had completely taken over my senses. All I know is that a few minutes later, I was in my own flat, throwing my most essential belongings into a backpack. My passport, my laptop, and most importantly, the cassette tapes. I left everything else behind. I ran out of the building, not daring to look back, disappearing into the anonymous crowds on the streets of Berlin. I went to the police. I told them everything, my voice trembling, offering them the tapes as proof. They looked at me with pity, the kind of look you give a stressed-out young student who has let his imagination run away with him. They went to the building. They spoke to the manager, who vehemently denied everything. They said they didn't have enough evidence to get a warrant to tear up the floor of a private apartment based on my strange story. They found nothing. I left Berlin right after that. I try to live a normal life now, but it's impossible. The paranoia is a part of me now, and it's justified. I tape over my laptop camera. I never have important conversations near electronic devices. I don't trust anyone. Ulrich's fate remains a mystery. He simply disappeared from the records after that last tape. Now, I think I understand why. You don't escape ghosts like these. I don't know who they are or why they targeted that apartment. I only know that they are still out there. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I wonder if the new tenant in my old Berlin apartment has found that shoebox yet.